So we've looked at a variety of ways, according to Griffin, that one can try and anchor or ground this notion of human rights. In our quest, again, what's a quest? Flesh out the idea of human rights, because once it was drained of its theological content, it left it a little bit, shall we say, rather thin. So how to flesh it out? And Griffin talked about some philosophers trying to derive it, this top-down approach, but they end up with a very different concept, he thinks. So he doesn't like that approach. But their philosophers are working with normative frameworks, evaluative frameworks, and so the Kant and Mill and Rawls framework. We looked a little bit at the Alan Gevirth approach, and Griffin found problems with all of them. So what about a very different approach, a non-philosophical approach, right? So he's not arguing with the philosophers anymore. Now, as we saw at the end of the last video, he mentioned, what about letting international law do the work about human rights? I mean, lawyers for international law are always talking about human rights, international courts. Why don't we just do that? I mean, that instead of all this fussing about philosophy. Not a bad suggestion, but it's got problems that Griffin tells us. So in this bit here, I want to talk a little bit about Griffin's reflections on human rights and international law. Now, he, ironically, at the end of this discussion, he admits that he doesn't know a lot about international law, which is fine. But I think what his point is that he knows enough about it such that it's not going to get you what you want. You don't have to know tons of international law to know that the approach of international law is not going to solve the philosophical problem of the indeterminateness of the concept of human rights. So that's really what he's after. Is like, yeah, international law is great. It can play a role, but it shouldn't be the only one. And by the way, he doesn't think philosophy should be the only role in the fleshing out of the concept of human rights either. So he's actually being quite moderate in his approach. He's just insisting on the importance of a philosophical analysis of the concept of human rights in order to make it clearer. All right, so the HR and international law line goes something like this. Let international law, right, IL, international law, determine the extension of HR. Don't worry about all this meaning stuff. Just let's let international law say where it's applied. And once you start applying a concept, the idea is that this international law, applying this concept by determining the extension of HR, this will help. There'll be a payoff, and the payoff will be that it will help determine the intention. So the payoff will be as international law will help determine how and where human rights are applied, and it will eventually give us a better understanding of what human rights really are. So hey, you get two things, right, out of international law: understanding the extension and ultimately better understanding the intention. Now Griffin has a difficulty with this. He says, well, it sounds good, but he doesn't use this term. I use it. There's kind of an authority problem with the asterisks. This approach, like just let international law do it. Think about this, though. And as a matter of fact, this has been something that some philosophers have worried about. By this approach is in a larger one of using legal mechanisms to solve all our problems in society. In other words, is it a good idea to always say, well, let's look at the legal system to solve this problem? Maybe this problem is a philosophical or an ethical problem. Is it always a good idea to simply go, let the law handle it, let the legal system handle it? Because in the end, Griffin is saying, well, there's a bit of an authority problem with this approach. And he says it quite bluntly. He says something like this: no person or organization or group or whatever can legitimately establish that a given X is a human right simply by declaring X is a human right. It can't legitimately establish that. Why? Well, it is, okay, think of it. It is just someone or some organization just saying, that's what we did. We just, bang, we just say this is a human right. Why? Griffin says, because it's always possible, okay, that this organization or person right? They could be wrong. In other words, it's always possible that, okay, like, so this is written, X is in a variable, like whatever you plug into it. That a given example for X, say some Z, okay, I mean, Z is supposed to be a particular kind of thing. And I'll look at an example of a Z in a moment here. But I just want you to get the logic of Griffin's argument, what I'm calling the authority problem. It's basically saying that, look, there's no organization that I can just say, they can't be wrong, right? When they say, hey, this is a human right, that I have to, just out of my mind, go, yeah, you're right, it's correct, it is. There's no way you could be wrong about that. Griffin is saying that that's not how we should let this work, right? It's always possible that the claim, right, that this claim that Z is an HR is false. We need to look at criteria for deciding these kinds of things. And here Griffin goes back into the philosophical mode. These are not things that judges can just say by fiat that this is a human right, or a legal system can just say, bang, this is just something that's legal. Because if you look at the history of legal systems, all kinds of horrible things that have been done were done inside, not always, but sometimes were done inside of a legal system, and the law permitted it, right? So according to that system in which that act was done, it was legal, but we would look at it in horror. I mean, you know, the great example, of course, comes out of the Nuremberg trials, right? Where one of the defenses for the atrocities that were committed were, well, you may not like them or whatever, but under the regime of the time, those kinds of things were legal, right? Now, I think many of us would be like, very reluctant to go, oh, okay then. But Griffin's point is along these lines, that just because something is declared as legal or declared to be a human right in a legal system, that's not good enough, right? That's not something we should just rely on. It's not that it's useless. That's important. He's not denying the usefulness of it, but he's saying that's not quite going to be enough. That's not sufficient. Is it necessary? He's not even saying that it's necessary or not, but he's certainly saying it's not sufficient. We need to look at what is a good argument to support this, right? So just the declaration is not going to work, right? That's largely what happens when you get things out of the theological construct and you get them down into the secular one. You've got arguments about these things. These are claims, right? Something is claimed to be a human right. Well, it could be wrong. It doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it could be wrong. So what's the argument? Like, why should I support it? I might like the idea, and as a philosopher, there are many ideas I may like, but I'm hesitant to support them until I see a good argument for them. So this is just being, I think what Griffin is saying is, let's just be critically minded, like lots of things are asserted to be human rights. Are they? And he uses an example. So just to flesh this out a little bit, Griffin points out of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And he says, look at Article 21. If you go to Article 21 of the document, it says that, how does it go? 1 second here. It mentions, okay, Article 21 talks about participation in government, namely that everyone has a right to participate in their country's government, either directly, like holding office, or indirectly through freely chosen representatives. That's a human right. So this right to participate in the government of your state, that's a human right. That one I find, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. Sure, I don't mind hearing an argument about that. But that one, I think most of us, maybe not all, but would be fairly sympathetic to it. It's kind of a democratic thing. But again, some people wouldn't. They might say, well, no, you'd have to justify it. But that one in the UDHR seems to be probably, yeah, most people would say, yeah, I'm kind of cool with that being a human right. Here's Article 25, Griffin points out, talks about paid holidays. Is that a human right? Well, I certainly like paid holidays. I certainly like to think that I'm entitled to a paid holiday. But if I don't get a paid holiday, have my human rights been violated? Maybe some kind of right that I have So Griffin is raising the possibility that although it's in this document next to, only a couple articles away from this one here, which we would say, oh yeah, I think that one, that's going to fly. This one you might be able to, you put it this way, you could do a challenge to this one. It would not be totally unreasonable to challenge that in the sense that maybe it's too vague. Maybe the job is not clear enough. Like, do you need, is every job or whatever? You have a right to participate in every government. Yeah, you might, but do you have a right to paid holidays from every job? So maybe you do, but the point that Griffin's making is that this one doesn't seem to make it up to this one's level. So this one, it would not be nonsensical to challenge this, or at least say, well, I think it's an entitlement, and yeah, I think people should get that. And I could even be a union negotiator and argue for it, but I don't know if I wouldn't have to then immediately say it's an absolute human right, no question, because it could be challenged in that. So in this sense that Griffin repeats an expression like we owe attention to whether the criteria for deciding, like there's some sort of moral obligation on us to make good arguments for the things that we want to assert as human rights. So we can claim these things, but just simply declaration. Nobody gets to just declare, no organization just gets to declare something as a human right, and that we all have to say yes, because, again, the UN declared this one. Could we question it? Griffin thinks, yeah, we could question it. Even if we think, yeah, you should get it, but it's not a human right or something. Might be different. Might be a civil right or some kind of legal right that doesn't meet the threshold. Or is there a threshold? Does anything in virtue of being a right just automatically slide into the human rights camp? Or all rights just human rights? It doesn't matter what right it is. It's a human right. So, of course, Griffin doesn't mention that, but think about it. If every right becomes a human right, then the whole category of rights is just the coextensive with human rights. So then adding human to rights doesn't really add anything because all rights are human rights. So in that sense, do we want to go that way? That's going to have certain kinds of consequences when you put everything into the same category. All right. And also, Griffin points out a few other things like we need more than just claims and lists and right, and I think he's sort of referring to this, like we need better than just lists. We need arguments. We need to talk about this and defend this. However, as I mentioned earlier, international law, legal stuff is helpful. It's not like this is useless or a distraction. It's just that we shouldn't just completely abdicate the sort of the philosophical task of examining, criticizing, arguing over these declarations. Because again, it's built right into the word. It's declaration. Well, that's a declaration. Does that make it legitimate? And Griffin is saying, hold on. Some of these, the declaration doesn't make it legitimate, even if what is declared is a human right. It's not the declaration that makes it legitimate. It's the argument that goes behind it. So you can yell out a truth. That doesn't make it a truth, right? You got to find the support, even if you're yelling truths. All right. So the law can help us clarify, but ethics, Griffin concludes his little discussion, ethics is really what he's after. He admits again he doesn't know a lot about international law, but he just thinks that this one here is pretty well the main thing is it can't be done, as he said, judges by fiat, just saying this is how it is and that everybody accept it. Clearly there's a philosophical framework in Griffin's thinking here, and that's what this book is about. So, but the main thing he ends on is that ethics must make a contribution to the clarification, and by trying to fit a clarified notion into our best ethics, that's the way to go. And seeing the notion of a human right as some kind of protector, a guardian of our moral, our normative agency, that's the best way to flesh this out. There are alternatives, but he thinks all things considered, that's the best way to fit with ethics. So in some ways, it's a coherency argument. What fits best together with what we think are human rights, and in some ways it's a quasi sort of reflective equilibrium. Those of you that are familiar with Rawls who got the idea largely from Nelson Goodman's philosophy, that what best sort of system all fits together with this notion, a fleshed out notion of human rights and our best ethics, that gives us our best system. That's what he's after in this book. So ethics at the end will be his main, and this empirical approach will be his main idea. And he also wants to include and talk about notions of dignity, which again is a historic notion, and he wants to add that sort of to the mix as well, to talk more meaningfully about the concept of human rights.